in our society. So why is this topic relevant, or how is it relevant? So with current conversation, in my opinion, about sex is very idle. We don't talk about it, it's very hush-hush. We act like we're embarrassed to talk about these things. But the issues surrounding sex are really dynamic. So there is the sexually transmitted diseases and infections. We can all talk about HIV and AIDS, but it's almost like it's only talked about when it's popular, or it's only talked about when it's romanticized, and not in more of a preventative way, talking more about STDs and STIs. Another conversation about sex that I don't think gets talked about enough is that sexual preference-based hate crimes are on a rise. I thought this was really important because we just had incidents of this on Spelman's campus not even 2 weeks ago. So by being so embarrassed and being so secretive about talking about sex, I think that it creates a lot of issues in terms of the way that we regard sex. And you'll see in some of these speculative fiction novels that the way they talk about sex does make you uncomfortable, because sometimes sex doesn't happen between a man and a woman. Sometimes sex doesn't happen between a human and a human. Sometimes sex, I'm serious, it happens between some aliens at some point. But it gets uncomfortable and it gets kind of sticky, and if sexual preference is something that we're not used to talking about, this could definitely be an issue with the way that we think about sex in our current society. And then finally is sexual violence against women. Another part of these speculative fiction novels is that a lot of the sex you'll see is kind of non-consensual, and then there's sex that is very non-consensual. And that, it's very non-consensual versus kind of non-consensual. But it definitely speaks to the rape culture that we keep hush-hush in our community currently. So how do Black female speculative writers address these issues? In my paper, I talk about these 3 novels, both by Octavia Butler, Parable of the Sower, and Dawn, and then Nnedi Okorafor's Who Fears Death. And just as a shameless plug, Nnedi Okorafor is going to be here for the Cosby Chair culminating event next week, so please come and support and see her. This is an awesome novel. But the way that they address the issues that I've talked about in terms of sex are very different in each of these 3 novels, which is why I chose them. In Parable of the Sower, we have a dystopian environment. In California, it is post-apocalyptic ? Believe it or not, it's only set 10 years from where we are now. And one thing that we see a lot in that novel is sexual violence running rampant. And no one uses condoms in that novel. I haven't heard anything, or never read anything in that novel about birth control. It's just a lot of risky behaviors that we don't talk about openly enough now, that I think 10 years in the future, Octavia Butler saw as being an issue. The second novel that I discuss is Dawn by Octavia Butler, and that's where sex gets really funky. It's when sex starts happening between aliens, but there's one alien that we don't know if it's a male or it's a female, and it really jars us. She takes this reader to a place where you are very uncomfortable. But this goes back to the world creating. We're in Octavia Butler's world. We are living by Lilith's rules. We have to then put ourselves in that situation and think about those societal norms that confine our thinking and make us so uncomfortable about these issues. And then the final novel, which is Who Fears Death by Nnedi Okorafor, the primary female protagonist actually is a product of rape. And the rape that she's a product of is not a crime of passion, it is absolutely a crime of control. It was purported on her mother by a man who wanted to end her family or her cultural bloodline. So they use sex as a weapon in this novel basically to end someone's cultural identity, because once this child is born, this child has no place in the world at all. And I think that this is another thing that we need to discuss, is more rape culture and how we as a society handle rape. A few of the questions that got me through my paper, what does sex look like in each of these novels? And is this sex in the future? So is it uncomfortable? Do we still not talk about it? Is it still risky? Are these still things that are issues 10 years from now? Are these going to be issues 20 years from now? Are we afraid to talk about same-sex relationships and same-sex sexual relationships? Are we afraid to talk about rape? Are we afraid to talk about STDs and disease? And has it changed from our current position to be better or worse? And then I said, who are these female protagonists having sex with? Are they men or are they even human? Is the sex consensual? And as I said before, Octavia Butler and Nnedi Okorafor and a lot of other speculative fiction writers take us to the place where we're asking ourselves these uncomfortable questions, and that we have to answer them based on the worldview that we're currently in and not from our current perspective. And what is the role of reproduction in the future? Are children a gift or are children a curse? In Parable of the Sower, we see children almost as more of a curse than a gift. They're a financial burden. That's something that we see today in our current society. There are some cultures that still don't want certain families to have a certain number of children if they can't afford to have them. Is this something that as a world culture we should be talking about? Is this something that we should be addressing, that we're policing women's reproductive rights to have as many children as they can fruitfully bear? And do the female protagonists get any satisfaction from sex in these novels? There's really only one person who actually enjoys the sex that she's having openly, and it's because she has a disease called hyperempathy. So when she's having sex, she's feeling her partner's enjoyment and her own enjoyment. But in the other novels, such as Dawn, we have our protagonist who's extremely reluctant about enjoying her sexual experience because she's still holding on to these archaic ideas from when she was human and lived on Earth before all the chaos happened. So she's holding herself back based on these old notions of beliefs that were made from people even before she was born that are still holding her back from enjoying her physical act that is her body. She has the right to enjoy the sex that she's having. Why shouldn't she? I did bring up one of my sources, who is Dr. Michelle Osherow. She's an associate professor of English at UNBC. And she brings in the revisionist theory point of view, which I thought was really interesting for Black speculative fiction. And she says, revisionist writing of female science fiction authors highlight women's potential to thwart the historical limitations imposed on female characters upon themselves. When coupled with Afrocentricity, I've had to practice that one, fiction serves to revise myths long held about racialized others, reconstructing previously acquired schemas regarding perceptions of African American women and historical contemporary texts. This actually kind of refocused my entire research for this paper because it made me think about Black speculative fiction female writers as revisionists. They're taking contemporary history, they're taking history in general, and they're rewriting it from a Black female's point of view and saying that if this happened on a different planet, if this happened somewhere else, would this still be a problem, or would it be acceptable? Would it be less acceptable? Would we even talk about it? And I think that what Dr. Osherow says is really true, in that that's what Black speculative fiction writers do. They take us to the place where we have no idea what's going on, and they ask us real questions, and they make us revise the way that we look at things that we may have looked at from an archaic or oppressive point of view beforehand. So a few final thoughts. I was thinking that by creating their own worlds with alternative rules, Black speculative fiction female writers have re-envisioned female sexuality that is complex, deep, and subjective. And with the development of characters who are sexually self-aware, Black female speculative fiction writers have redefined in various ways female sexuality.